Before jumping right into slides, though, I just wanted to go over just the course materials real quick because I know I dumped a lot of files onto a website and just to make sure you know what's on there. And then right after that, I know you're amped up to just learn about some growth modeling this morning or afternoon, whichever time zone, or evening perhaps, whichever time zone you might be coming from. So real quick, just going to share my screen, make sure that I have the right one here. All right, so just real quick, so on the Google Drive site that I believe was shared with everyone, the main slides that I'm going to be talking from here today are under the main course slides. And there are two different versions because I know whenever I use someone else's slides or learn from people, I always like to see the software code right next to the material people are talking about. So rather than jumping back and forth between different software, I have full code for everything in M+, and then also in Lavon if you're an R user. So there's separate versions of the slides if you want to make notes as you go along. These are not two separate things. All the concepts are going to be the same on either set of slides. The only difference is the code and the output, depending on which software you prefer, or if you want to use both, you can compare them side to side. So just thought it'd be a little bit easier to put things in that format. So that's just the reason why there's two sets of slides, just because of the different software options. The other thing here at the bottom that might have been a little bit ambiguous was I know a lot of times when I teach courses like this, people are taking the course for a reason. Usually it's for a paper or a project or a report. And a question that comes up is, where are you getting this material from in the slides? Do you have a reference for that? So I put together this big list of all the references that everything in the course comes from. And it's split up by topic. And so if after the course you have a paper, you have a project, and you want to say, Dan said that, where did that come from? There's like 10 or 11 pages or something like that of references, just one after the other, so you have that information if you want to know where some of the details from the slides are coming from. There's also some specific references on the slides as well, but this is just more of a general list if the topic excites you also and you want to go and read some of the source papers for where these things come from. All right, I think everything else here is fairly self-explanatory. So there's a couple of exercises that if we get to, or if you want to do on your own here, and then the data where all the examples come from in the slides. So, but all right, so just wanted to cover that real quick, just so you knew what was there and where the material, what you should be taking notes on. Do I have a question in the chat here? Super helpful. Thanks. So, all right. So without further ado, I'll pull up the slides and we'll just get going right off the bat here. So, all right. So as you hopefully are aware, this is latent growth modeling. So welcome. I'll do my flight attendant impression. You have lots of choices when you take courses like this. So I appreciate you choosing to take it with me, and hopefully we'll learn something together. As we go through, please don't hesitate to ask questions either in the chat or you can raise your hand so I can see you on the participant list. I don't mind questions as we go. If it does get a little off topic, though, I might ask you to email me or use the Slack page so that I can have a little bit more in-depth conversation rather than veer off course to answer the question live. So. All right, quick overview of the course. So basically 5 sections in the slides that we're going to cover for the next couple days. Today we're going to start with some of the basics of longitudinal data and longitudinal data analysis. We'll talk a little bit about different types of longitudinal data, why we need a full dedicated course on them, what makes them special, what makes them different than other types of data. And also touch a little bit on repeated measures ANOVA and why that's not often enough for some more complex analyses. I know that this is kind of the gateway method into longitudinal data, and it's one that people are familiar with, or supervisors or project managers often start with. And I'll try to motivate why learning latent growth modeling is important to move beyond some of the limitations of that classical method. Then today we'll also hit a little bit on latent growth model basics. What is it? How do you talk about the models? How do you start to specify the models? Either later today, later in this session or in the second session tomorrow. We'll get into an example of that. We'll see some output, we'll see some code, we'll see some interpretations, some APA formatting of results as well. Third section, we'll start to add predictors and covariance and really start to build these models up. We'll talk about centering predictors, which if that doesn't sound familiar, don't worry, there'll be plenty of slides to pique your interest on that. And talk about centering to improve interpretation as well. And then sections 4 and 5 are going to be some more advanced topics. So we'll get into things like what happens if I have multiple outcome variables that I want to model at the same time. How do things kind of interact with each other, or how do they change together as time unfolds? We'll also talk about some nonlinear growth. So a lot of research topics involve human subjects who don't always grow in perfect linear fashion. So how do we have a little bit more realistic patterns of growth in areas where that may be of interest? And the last section that time permitting, hopefully that we'll be able to get to is missing data, model fit, and then time unstructured data, which means what happens if I collect participants at all different times, or what happens if some participants only have different numbers of repeated measures than other participants. So that's the general roadmap that we're going to go through. So hopefully today we'll get through section 1 and a little bit, maybe halfway of section 2. All right. So with that said, we'll just jump right in. So buckle up. So overview of longitudinal data. So I just wanted to start briefly with just a broad overview of what longitudinal data is and which portion of it we're going to cover in this course today. So longitudinal data is a broad term, basically covers anything where people or units are followed over time. So you have multiple observations per person or per unit, depending on what your research question focuses on. In behavioral sciences like psychology, education, there's sometimes this growth modeling and longitudinal data are sometimes used synonymously or interchangeably. But in the broader statistical framework, these two things are not always the same. There's different types of longitudinal data that sometimes require different methods or that are trying to address different questions. So I just wanted to have a couple slides here at the beginning to say what are some other types of longitudinal data that we won't cover, just in case, just so you have a broad overview of when someone says longitudinal data, what are the different types of things or questions to which they might be referring. So in this general longitudinal data, in this general definition of longitudinal data, there's two general kinds, at least as I think of it. There's repeated measures data, and then there's time to event data. And so time to event data usually take the form of when we're interested in when or whether some event happens. So if you're coming from a biostatistics background, this is going to be something usually referred to as survival analysis. If you have an engineering background, it's usually called reliability analysis. And in this type of model or data structure, the outcome that you're interested in is some binary event occurrence. So at a certain time point, has an event occurred or not? And your interest, at least longitudinally, is how long does it take for some event to occur? And so this is a little bit different than the models we're going to talk about mostly in this seminar, which is how things are changing. But this is one type of longitudinal data that sometimes shows up in different areas. So you'll typically see plots that look like this, where you'll have time there on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is going to be some proportion of observations where the event has not yet occurred. And then as time goes forward, more and more people start to experience the event. And so these plots start to staircase down a little bit. That more people start to experience things, and so fewer and fewer people survive, so to speak, in the analysis. And so um, research examples of this, have death or relapse in cancer patients. If you're studying substance use, you might have time until teenagers start to use marijuana or start to experiment with alcohol. In more social settings, how long it takes for someone to get married or to become a parent. Or if you're in that more engineering framework, um, uh, you're talking about failure in electronic parts. How long does it take for your iPhone to break or for your car parts to need to be replaced? And so this is, again, one type of longitudinal data. This is uh, um, not a method that we're going to cover in depth in this seminar, but just so you have just a broader understanding of longitudinal data, if you see people talk about Kaplan-Meier curves or proportional hazards models, these are the type of data to which those models refer. So the plot that I showed you a minute ago was an example of a Kaplan-Meier plot or Kaplan-Meier curve, trying to track, what number of, trying to track who has experienced the event at which time points. You can extend this with something called a Cox model or a proportional hazards model that is going to try to explain with covariates why some people last longer than others. So if you're comparing different chemotherapy regimens, does which regimen someone get affect how long affect their survival or how long they remain uh, 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 how long they remain disease free or something like that. So again, not a method we're going to cover too much in this seminar, but I just wanted to mention it to be so that you're aware of it if you come across longitudinal data or if you collect longitudinal data, so that at least you have some very vague familiarity with what people are talking about when they have this type of data. So the other branch that we're going to focus on more in this course is this more repeated measures idea. Um, and there's two kinds of repeated measures designs that people will typically employ. I'll first talk about one that we're not going to cover in detail in the course, and then I'll finally get to the point and talk about the methods that we are going to talk about here for the remainder of our time together. And so intensive longitudinal data is uh, one type of longitudinal data that are being collected more and more frequently, especially as things like smartphones and wearables are becoming more common. So intensive longitudinal data is typically characterized by having a lot of repeated measures. So I'm asking the same people the same questions very frequently, typically over a short window. So these are types of research designs where you see people responding to a smartphone prompt maybe 2, 3, 4 times a day, every day for 2 weeks, or every day for 3 weeks, or some very short duration, but a lot of data are being collected in a short amount of time. And so designs that you may come across in this area, so you have experience sampling, EMA or ecological momentary assessment, and daily diary data. So if you come across these types of designs or people mentioning these in a research talk or a paper, this is a lot of measurements over very short duration. And the distinguishing feature of data in this kind of research design is that people are not usually interested in change. They're usually more interested in fluctuation. So this is not typically a growth-related question. It's usually interested in variance or fluctuation or inertia or volatility are the words that often come up here. Now, so just as some examples, so if you're talking about pain ratings in arthritis patients, day to day, how do people feel? Are they, when they wake up in the morning, do they have more pain than they do in the afternoon than they do at night? Really trying to leverage the high frequency of data collection here. Same thing with people's urge to smoke or to drink. Again, it's very, very dense data collection, trying to see fluctuations over time. Also with anxiety or depression symptoms. So if you talk about what does this kind of data look like in terms of a plot, typically looks something like this, where there's not a lot of change from left to right. So if I kind of draw an average trend through this, the line would look pretty horizontal. But what I'm interested in are the peaks and valleys in people's responses, not necessarily the average trend or average trajectory over time. And so with models like this, it's trying to explain, why do people suddenly, have a peak at night or have a trough in the morning? What about their fluctuation? What can I say about that? How can I predict that? How can I get people to be more stable? But again, not necessarily saying how does the average of the outcome systematically change as a function of time. And so models that you might come across that kind of fit into this branch, so autoregressive models, which you try to capture carryover effects. So how does my depression this morning carry over into the afternoon? How strongly does one time point or how I feel at one time, one measurement carry over to the next? Same thing with location scale models, except the focus is on the variability. What predicts how high or how low those peaks and troughs are, or what predicts how stable or volatile someone's responses are. There's also dynamic structural equation models that combine aspects of different models together, like multi-level or autoregressive models into one framework. So again, interest here, if you're collecting a lot of repeated measures over a short amount of time, usually more interest in the variance, not necessarily in the growth. Okay, so with time to event data and intensive longitudinal aside, I'll start to focus in more on the models we're going to talk about in the seminar today. And that's going to be on things usually applied to panel data. So a feature of panel data is that there's a relatively small number of repeated measures taken from the same people over a relatively long time span. So unlike intensive longitudinal data where you're trying to get people to respond 3, 4, 5 times a day, panel data are usually spread out a little bit. So you might measure people every couple months or every year or every 2 years. The focus here is on evaluating change over time. And so the design of the study is usually allows for some development to occur between the time periods. So intensive longitudinal data doesn't care about growth, so you don't have a lot of time between the measurements because there's no process or development that you're expecting to unfold. In panel data, if I'm looking at reading ability in kids, I have to give them enough time to learn how to read or to improve their reading skills in order to see some discernible change. So different type of research question necessitates a different type of design or a different type of data collection or data structure. And so with this type of design, I have fewer repeated measures, but spread out over more time to allow that change to occur. And then the main question or the main focus here is, how does the mean of the outcome change? or what are the individual differences in the growth patterns? So why do some people grow faster than others? Is there variance in between the growth trajectories? And if there is, can I add predictors to explain why some people change at different rates? So again, two classes of models within this broader idea of panel data. There's one broad class is marginal models, which here basically are interested in the average growth trajectory across people. So I want to see how the average person changes. These type of models are not really interested in quantifying individual differences. So I don't want to know why two different people's growth curves differ from each other. I just want to know what the typical growth pattern might look like. And so these models are usually regression models that just relax certain assumptions that occur in longitudinal data. And so if you want to think about visualizing what these data might look like, it's usually a plot that looks like this with one line fit through it to try to get the general or overall trajectory. So in this example, I have some verbal ability scores, and they're changing in some way, and I'm trying to fit a line through it that best captures how that outcome is changing. I'm not interested in how person one's change might be different from person two. I just want to know what the typical change looks like over the entire time span. And finally, to distill down into the models that we're going to talk about in this seminar specifically, these are going to be subject-specific or person-specific models. And to start to set the scene for the kinds of ideas we're going to talk about today, these type of models do ask questions about the mean growth or what the typical growth pattern looks like for the entire sample. But they also are going to ask questions about subject-specific growth curves. So what does the change pattern look like for person 7? What about for person 12? How do those two things look different? How do those two things look different? And what are the characteristics of those people that might predict why their change patterns are not identical, or what are the individual differences in change? And so just as a visual representation of the kinds of models and the kinds of questions we're going to see in this seminar, this is going to be a plot like this. So this is visual cortex. This is a part of the brain and how big it is as kids start to develop. On the top, we see some raw data where as kids start to age, so here they're going from 0 to about 6 years old. How does the size of that part of their brain change? Uh, on the bottom, we have some model that we're going to fit. So the red line is the typical or the average change across all of these kids in my sample. But each one of these black lines is going to be an individual or subject-specific curve. So we see some kids really grow quickly and level out fast. Some kids, it takes them a little bit longer for their visual cortex to grow to its full size. But a main interest of these models is to quantify those individual differences and to really go in and try to explain them and say, I don't just care about the average person. I really want to know why people differ from each other. Okay, that's my overview of longitudinal data and where we're going to go in this seminar. Were there any questions or any clarifications just on the first couple of ideas that we presented here? No? Okay. If not, then we'll move right along and start to talk about growth modeling specifically. So we'll talk about things like the data structure, what makes these data special, and also why we need dedicated models to take care of some of the nuances and unique aspects of data that are collected to ask questions about growth or individual differences. So what's so special about longitudinal data? So you may have taken a regression course or may have taken ANOVA, but why do you need methods in this course to help you really open up your statistical toolkit and address some of these questions? So one of the basic issues that kind of come up in longitudinal data are statistically related. So because of the research design, when you collect multiple data points for each person, you're going to end up violating some of the traditional assumptions of a regression or an ANOVA model. So traditional models like regression and ANOVA are going to make an independence assumption. So they're going to assume that every data point that you have is independent, or specifically that the errors are independent of each other. So this means every data point has 100% unique information and they're not related to the other data points that you may have collected. This is almost certainly not going to be true when you have longitudinal data, because when measurements are collected from the same person, they're going to almost certainly be dependent or correlated in some way. So if you collect 3 repeated measures from me, my second repeated measure is going to be more like my first repeated measure than they will be to your data, which is in direct violation of this independence assumption. So my data are not 100% unique. Individual characteristics about me will kind of permeate throughout all of the data that I provide. And so my individual or personal characteristics are going to carry through to all of my repeated measures. And so a traditional model like a regression will not account for this. It will assume that the repeated measures have no correlation, that they're completely independent. And that's just not a fact of data when they're collected in this way. So from a statistical standpoint, we want to make sure that our models are able to account for this dependence between observations. A second statistical consideration is about about the variance. So ANOVA and regression are going to typically make a homoscedasticity assumption, meaning that the variance or the error variance are going to be constant across all of the observations. This may not be true when you collect data longitudinally, especially if you're interested in questions about development, or if you have data focusing on kids or adolescents who are rapidly changing over time. The variance of your outcome may not be stable over time. So you might get variance that starts to expand as time goes forward. The variance might contract. But either way, we want to have models that are flexible enough to allow variance to change over time, rather than being locked into assuming that the variance is necessarily constant. So traditional models typically make that assumption to say constant variance. When we have longitudinal data, we want to be a little more free in our ability to say whether the variance is constant over time, or whether there might be patterns in that variance that we might be able to exploit or explain. Longitudinal models allow us to do that, as we'll see when we get to some examples later in the seminar. So those are some statistical considerations. So talking about assumptions of traditional models that may be violated when we have longitudinal data. There's also some substantive considerations. So longitudinal data is going to allow us to ask or expand the types of questions we can ask. So a linear regression will mostly fit a line through data points to tell us about typical or average how the outcome changes as a function of those predictors. But in longitudinal studies, you might have more expansive questions. So you might want to ask about the effect of a predictor at a particular time point, or the behavior of the outcome at the beginning or the end of the study. So maybe we have an intervention and we want to know at the end of the study, how are two time points different from each other? That might be a little hard to specify in a regression, but in the models we'll talk about here, that's fairly easy to specify in a way that gives us that quantity as a direct estimate that we can talk about explicitly. As we mentioned a couple slides ago, we also might have questions about individual differences. So we might want to know not just what the growth rate is or what the average person's change looks like. We might want to talk about variability or between person variance, also known as individual differences. So why are some people different from each other? How different are they? And what explains those differences? With longitudinal data, we also might want to talk about different levels of analysis. We might want to talk about within person differences versus between person differences. So we might want to talk about characteristics that are different for people. So maybe I got assigned to the intervention group and you didn't. We also might want to talk about things that vary within the same person. So maybe I smoked a cigarette at time 2 and that affected my anxiety differently than at time 3 when I didn't smoke. So we can talk about predictors at different levels and how they affect our outcome of interest in different ways. Okay, I'll pause briefly here. Any questions, any clarifications so far? No? Okay. All right. Last point of this introductory material before we start seeing some models and some statistics and some output is just about the data structure. Because this is before you can start analyzing data or talk about models, it's got to be the data structure has to be set up in an appropriate way for these methods to be applicable. So because longitudinal data have this characteristic where every person has multiple data points or multiple observations, there's different ways that the data structure can be set up. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about those different ways and what the advantages or disadvantages of each are, and when you might prefer one type versus the other. So just as an overview, the two main formats are going to be wide and long. And so if you see longitudinal data or work with longitudinal data frequently, you'll see these words start to come up, and sometimes they'll cause you more consternation if someone sends you wide format data and you're looking for long format data, or the other way around. So I'll show you some examples in a second, but the main one sentence definition of each is that wide data are going to be, every person is going to occupy only one row, and you'll have a lot of columns for the different repeated measures. Long format data, there's going to be one column that has your outcome, but your data are going to occupy a lot of rows. So this is where the origin of wide and long come from. So wide data have many columns, long data are going to have many different rows. So different types of software and different types of models will use or require different data structures. And so there are some supplemental slides on that course site that talk about how to change between different structures if someone on your research team provides you data in a structure that is not is not in the structure that you need it. It won't go through that code in the slides in these main slides, but there is supplemental slides if that is of interest. So Talking about the different data structures is way less effective than just showing you what they look like. So I just thought I would show a graphic here. So this is going to be long format data. And so this is a hypothetical data set where I have 4 repeated measures per person. And so in long format data, you'll have at least 3 columns. So the first one is going to be a person ID or participant number or something like that. The second one is going to be an index for time. And the last one is going to be the outcome variable that you're collecting from different people. And so what long format data are going to look like is every person is going to occupy multiple rows in the data set. And so here I see the ID variable gets repeated 4 different times. So person 1 is going to occupy 4 rows. Each row is going to correspond to a different time point. So here the first row is person 1 time 1. Second row is person 1 at time 2. Third row is person 1 at time 3, and so forth. You'll see that score, I called it score, but this is just whatever your dependent variable or your outcome is. That value is going to change in each row because it corresponds to the outcome at a different point in time for that person. So another way to think about this would be person 1's data. I asked them 4 times. Their values were 4, 6, 7, and 8. I then see down here towards the bottom, the person ID variable here rolls over to 2, and then the time variable starts over from 1 and starts counting again. So I now see 1, 2, and 3. If I had more room on these slides, it would keep expanding to 4. Here's person 2's values, 2, 4, and 6. And the data would continue on from there with multiple rows per person. The ID format gets, the ID value there gets repeated. And this time index is going to count up from 1 or 0 to however many time points that person has. Are we okay with this format? Questions or clarifications here? No? Okay. So long format data are most common if you're using a multi-level or a mixed effect model to fit your growth or longitudinal model. So we won't see too many data sets in class that follow this format because it's not common for latent growth modeling. This format is popular for plotting, and it is a popular form for collecting data. So even if you're going to fit latent growth models, you may see data in this format, and it may not match the format that a latent growth model will typically want the data to be in. The format that a latent growth model that we're going to focus on here usually takes the wide format. So it's going to look a little bit different. Instead of having a person ID variable get repeated for every row, instead I'm going to see the person ID only appear once. Instead, every column is going to indicate a new time point or a new repeated measure. So whereas on the previous slide, person 1's data was 4, 6, 7, and 8, but it appeared in different rows, now I see those same values, 4, 6, 7, and 8, but they appear in different columns. So I'm going horizontally across the data set rather than vertically, which again is with the origin of calling this data the wide format. So every person is going to occupy one row. The repeated measures are going to occupy multiple columns. So the data is going to be bigger left to right rather than top to bottom. When I have multiple people, they will just then occupy different rows. So I have row 1 corresponds to all the repeated measures for person 1. Row 2 corresponds to all the repeated measures for person 2, and so on. So this data structure is also sometimes called multivariate because your repeated measures are different variables in the data. So time 1 is a separate column or variable than time 2, then time 3, and time 4. This is opposed to the long format, which is sometimes called a univariate format, because your outcome is a single column. So if you were going to model this in software, you'd only use one variable label to correspond to your outcome measure. So most latent growth modeling software will use data in the wide format. So if you are thinking of applying a latent growth model to the data that you're collecting, this is before you even get to software, before you even get to modeling, this is the format that you want to make sure your data are in for almost all software that apply these models. This is also the format in the data that I have on the course site. Tried to provide the data in this format to make it easier to work with. But just note that you may not always get data in this format right from the start. You may have to transform it. And there are those supplementary slides to help you do that if you get data in a format that is not the wide format. All right, so let's start to talk about some modeling. I know that was a little bit tedious, so I'm sorry to start off on a slow note, but I want to make sure that we at least had a common set of terminology before we just started jumping right into the models. So first thing we're just going to talk about is why do we need latent growth models, and what can they do that repeated measures ANOVA cannot? So if you took a graduate statistics sequence, normally ANOVA and regression are kind of the foundations of a lot of methods. You may have touched on repeated measures ANOVA. It's still commonly used, but what are some of the weaknesses, and what are ways that we can expand that with a latent growth model or some of these more sophisticated longitudinal approaches? So just as a quick refresher on repeated measures ANOVA for longitudinal data, if it's been a while since you've seen it. So repeated measures ANOVA operates on a wide format data set. And basically, it operates in an ANOVA framework. So ANOVA typically has a factor variable and is interested in comparing the means across levels of that factor. More traditionally, this would be something like, condition 1, condition 2, condition 3, or, drug A and drug B and drug C would be the levels of your factor. Repeated measures ANOVA just kind of squints a little bit and says, well, I can look at time as a factor and say my different levels of time are 1, 2, 3, and 4, the different repeated measures that I collected from my participants. So repeated measures ANOVA is just a standard ANOVA with time as the factor variable in which you are interested. So in this case, my hypothesis that I would be interested in a repeated measures ANOVA looks very similar to a standard ANOVA, which just says, is the mean at time 1 equal to the mean at time 2? Equal to the mean of however many time points you may have. So if we go back to the terminology we saw on the first couple slides, this would be qualified as a marginal model. That I'm not interested in individual differences here. I'm just looking at the averages across everyone, and I'm trying to talk about how those averages may change over time. So this is one first weakness of repeated measures ANOVA. If you're interested in individual differences, those do not show up here in this model. So as an example, so let's say we have 40 people who we follow over 9 different time points, and we're interested in their depression symptoms. So I have some score or some questionnaire that I ask. It goes from 0 to 100. In this case, there are 20 items. Each item is on a 0 to 5 scale. Higher values are going to indicate more symptoms of depression. And so I'll have 20 people in a treatment group, I'll have 20 people in a control group, and I want to talk about differences in depression symptoms over time. As with most longitudinal data, it helps to plot it and to get an idea of what it looks like. So here's what's an exploratory plot, sometimes called a spaghetti plot, because it looks like you kind of took some pasta and threw it onto a plate. If you want to see how to make this plot, there are supplemental plotting slides on the course website there. So on this plot, every line here represents one person's data. And this is exploratory. I haven't fit any models yet. This is essentially a connect the dots of each person's data. So at each time point, what did this data look like? This red line through the middle here is the average person. So what does the typical trend look like in depression symptoms from time 0 up to time, or from time 1 rather, up to time point number 9? So in general, based on this trend line, I see that scores generally dip. They end up lower than when they started. The change looks like it is somewhat constant at the beginning, and then once I get to about time point 6, it starts to level out towards the end. Here, just as some R code for talking about repeated measures, ANOVA. So I won't go through this too in depth because it's not our focus, but the basic idea is that you assign time to a factor variable to say, I want to treat all 9 of those time points as levels of one broader factor. In this case, I have treatment versus control, so I want to treat that as a second factor. So this is basically a two-way ANOVA, saying I have one within person factor, I have one between person factor, and then I can set my model up with an interaction term to say, I want to see if there's differences over time. I want to see if there's differences across the treatment versus control. And then I want to see if changes over time differ by treatment and control. So that would be my interaction term in this repeated measures ANOVA. So I'll say that one more time. So the main effect, I would have 2 of them. Is there a difference between treatment and control? My second main effect would be, is there a difference in the means across time? And then my interaction would be, does change over time differ between the 2 groups? Do the means change differently in treatment than in control? And so if we fit a repeated measures ANOVA here, we'll see we get tests of each one of these effects in the output. Won't go through this in too much detail, but you see first row is going to say if I average over time and just say what's the average depression symptoms in treatment versus the average depression symptoms in control. Are those 2 things different? Here I have a large p-value, so the answer would be no. We can already start to see some of the how this may not address our actual research questions. So I collected a lot of time points here. I have 9 time points, and the first thing repeated measures ANOVA is going to do is it's going to average over them and just say, does the average across all 9 time points in treatment equal the average of all 9 time points in control? So it basically ignores that all those repeated measures that I took all that time and energy to collect. So that hypothesis is not super meaningful to us if we have longitudinal data. The second test that's going to come out is it's going to ask if the mean of depression scores is going to be equal at all 9 points. So this is the null hypothesis that the mean depression score for times 1 through 9 are all equal to each other. The p-value on that is quite low, so it seems rather unlikely that the means are different, but it doesn't give us a lot of information about how those things are different. So when we went back to this plot of the data here, we could probably infer that the mean of time 1 is not equal to the mean of time 9 without even running a statistical test. What's more interesting is probably how the means change over time, not the fact that whether or not they are equal. That's not what a repeated measures ANOVA is going to ask. It's just asking about strict equality of means over time, not about the question of how the means are changing. Same thing for that last test of time by that interaction of treatment group by time. How are these things equal or different? We see that the p-value is basically right on the border. But if we're being strict, it's above 0.05, saying not enough evidence to suggest that those trajectories are different. But again, it's all in terms of broad averages. It's not telling us about specific types of change. It's just talking about things in terms of first step in the ANOVA is taking all of those repeated measures, taking all of those people, and just reducing them down to a single data point. And so, quick summary is repeated measures ANOVA is standard for longitudinal data, but it almost works counter to how we like to build statistical models. So it basically takes the existing ANOVA framework and tries to make longitudinal data fit into it, rather than trying to build a model specifically for the nuances of longitudinal data. And so even though it's a classical method, it's still popularly used. It does have some edge cases where it can be useful. A lot of modern methods can expand beyond it by giving you answers to questions about growth trajectories, about individual differences, and it does so in a way where the first step is not to immediately summarize everything into means and to kind of aggregate over all of those repeated measures that were taken. So to spell out some of the disadvantages oh, we got a question. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering, you mentioned that our repeated measures ANOVA can not tell us how things differ, only if they differ, right?
At least in these omnibus tests that come out of the output right here, yes, that it's mostly about if, not a matter of how.
Okay. Because I was thinking there might be post hocs that do that, right? But that's maybe out of our scope right now.
Nope, that's a great question. I figured I should have mentioned that. You're exactly right that these omnibus tests are just going to tell you if. You can do follow-up things like contrast, or there's tests of trend that can accompany repeated measures ANOVA. But the key word there is that they are post hoc. They're not the main focus. They're kind of the follow-up test to this more omnibus hypothesis that's being presented. So it's almost of kind of a secondary consideration, whereas usually that's the main focus, is how things are changing, at least to some statisticians say that shouldn't be relegated to a secondary step as this follow-up. It should be the focus and the main question driving the models and how they're built, rather than saying, oh, well, I'm first testing this omnibus test that is really not, it's fairly tangential to what the question that I actually may. Does
Cool.
that
Thank you.
help
Yeah.
somewhat? Okay. Question that came up in the chat is, would repeated measures ANOVA be appropriate for data with only two time points? That's a good question, and that's one that comes up. So two time point data often can be a lot of opinions about how to deal with that. I think, yes, repeated measures ANOVA would be more interesting if you only had two time points, based on my perspective, because there's not necessarily an interesting way to model the trend or how the means are changing, because you only have two of them. You can only connect the dots. I'll hit on a couple of differences, a couple of weaknesses of repeated measures ANOVA in the next couple slides. that may, even though it might be the best case for repeated measures ANOVA, if you have 2 time points, that it still might not be your best option because of things, just as a preview, things like missing data, things like variances are assumed to follow a particular structure. So if you have 2 data points, what if the variance at time 1 is different from the variance at time 2? As I'll talk about in a couple slides, that may not always be easy to accommodate in an ANOVA framework. Okay, good. Glad that helped. All right. So just to distill some of in addition to this question of does repeated measures ANOVA test a hypothesis that I am interested in? Um, I would argue not necessarily, as was mentioned a second ago, you might be able to get at that information, but you do so post hoc or as a secondary step in the analysis rather than the main focus. Some disadvantages of repeated measures ANOVA just about data structure or from a more statistical rather than substantive perspective. One main weakness with longitudinal data concerns missing data. So repeated measures ANOVA assumes no missing data over time, which with longitudinal data, if you have collected it or have some yourself or have some experience working in this area, missing data are usually the rule rather than the exception with human subjects research. So because of attrition, because of difficulty retaining participants, usually people are going to drop out at some point. Repeated measures ANOVA is a traditional method. Its estimation is based on something called least squares, which is a method that was easy to do by hand, but is something we still use today, but not when we have missing data. We have more sophisticated estimation approaches that can accommodate aspects of missing data a little easier. But because repeated measures ANOVA is in this more traditional framework, if you have 1 time point missing, you're going to be list-wise deleted. So if I have 9 repeated measures in this data set, if someone gave me answers for time 1 through 8, but didn't show up for time point 9, I'm going to lose all of that person's data if I were to use repeated measures ANOVA. And this can have a drastic effect on power in this in a longitudinal context where 30 or 40% missingness is somewhat common. So it can reduce your effective sample size just by the nature of how the estimation and how the method was built to function. Because again, repeated measures ANOVA is about 100 years old at this point. And again, it was kind of built up to put longitudinal data into an ANOVA framework, not necessarily to accommodate unique aspects of longitudinal data directly. So this is one potential issue that can come up with repeated measures ANOVA. It's missing data, a big problem with longitudinal data. A second weakness that's a little not it's a little more nuanced, but still as important, is that repeated measures ANOVA assumes that each measure that you collect is equally correlated with all of the other measures. Again, this stems to the traditional origin of repeated measures ANOVA when statistics were still largely done by hand. This makes the calculation easier. It makes the calculation faster. It makes it more manageable if you, God forbid, ever had to do this by hand. But it can be unrealistic with what our expectations of repeated measures data may be. So this is sometimes called the sphericity assumption, which means that the variance at every time point is equal and the correlation between every pair of time points is also equal. So if it helps to visualize what that correlation matrix might look like, it means that all of the diagonal terms are going to be constant. So that would be sigma squared here on the diagonal. It means variance at time 1 is equal to the variance at time 2, time 3, time 4, time 5, however many time points we have. The bigger issue is the off diagonals, and this is going to come up a lot when we talk about longitudinal data throughout these slides, which is a big question in longitudinal data is how do the repeated measures correlate? Because we said in the beginning that they are not going to be independent, so a traditional regression is going to assume those values are zero. Repeated measures ANOVA is one step up from that. It says the off diagonals aren't going to be zero, so time point 1 and time point 2 are not going to be uncorrelated. But it does put a restriction and say that all of the correlations are the same thing. So if time point 1 and time point 2, let's say they have a correlation of 0.3, that's going to hold for the correlation between time 1 and time 8, or time 2 and time 6. That if you pick any pair of repeated measures, they will have the same correlation. And that's an assumption that gets built into repeated measures ANOVA. We typically don't like this assumption because typically as time points get spread further apart, they become less correlated. So time 1 and time 9 are probably going to be less correlated than time 1 and time 2, just based on the distance between those repeated measures. This structure sometimes can hold if you have data that are collected fairly close together, but as your data get more spread out, it becomes less tenable to assume equal correlations between all the repeated measures. Again, there are corrections for this. So either if you've heard of greenhouse geyser or the Hundfeld test or correction, there are ways to try to fix this problem or fix violations of this problem. But this gets at the issue that I mentioned earlier of repeated measures ANOVA seems like it's trying to jam longitudinal data into an existing framework rather than trying to accommodate the nuances of longitudinal data directly. This is also related to the question that came in the chat about two time point data. This assumption on the correlation or covariance between repeated measures. If you had two time point data, the assumption would be that the variance at time 1 and time 2 are going to be equal to each other. Perhaps that's true, but it may not be, and some other methods might be able to model that type of data more flexibly. Another potential disadvantage of repeated measures ANOVA for kind of modern longitudinal data assumes each person is measured the exact same number of times. So it assumes that if you, because time is treated as a factor variable, if someone, if you have five different levels of that factor, it assumes everyone has all five. So this is not always how longitudinal studies are designed. Sometimes the interest is in maximizing the data that you can collect. So person 1 might have 7 measurements because they could come into the lab or they could fill out a questionnaire 7 times. Someone else might have 4, someone else might have 3. Repeated measures ANOVA doesn't really allow you to have that data structure. It says if 7 is the number of levels of time, I'm expecting to see 7 repeated measures for every person. If someone has less than 7 repeated measures, those are considered missing, and that person will get listwise deleted. So even if person 3 didn't have 7 opportunities to provide data, they were only asked to come into the lab 5 times, the model doesn't really care about that. It just sees there should be 7 time points. If you have anything less than 7, I'm going to consider that missing and that participant will be removed. Third point here, so issues about individual variability or individual differences. So as we mentioned a couple slides ago, repeated measures ANOVA is going to be in that marginal model framework. It's going to look at averages across people. It's not going to give us information about how variable that mean change is. So it's not going to tell us about if the mean change in person 1 is different than the mean change in person 6 or person 9. It's just going to say averaged across everyone, the change looks like this. This is also true of those follow-up, the post hoc or the planned contrast question that came up a minute ago. Those tests can give you tests of different types of trends, but again, that's going to be trends in the average across the entire data set. It won't give you information about how variable that trend or change might be across different people. And last point here is something we alluded to also before, is the question that repeated measures ANOVA asked might not be interesting to the question that you may have. So a lot of statistical modeling, the focus is on trying to find a model that matches your research question. Repeated measures ANOVA sometimes works in the opposite direction, where it kind of boxes people into questions that they may not have. So a lot of times in longitudinal data, one of our interests is what the growth trajectory looks like, adding covariates to explain why there are differences in the growth trajectory, adding predictors or covariates into the model to say what affects where people start or what affects how fast they grow. Those types of questions are not impossible to answer in repeated measures ANOVA, but they're not the main focus. The main focus or the main hypotheses that are being presented in this framework is usually about mean change and omnibus tests about equality. And so summary here is repeated measures ANOVA is a common starting point when people start to embark on longitudinal analyses. There's nothing, it's not the worst model to choose, but it does have some deficiencies because it was developed a while ago. It was developed for hand calculation of estimations. There are more modern methods that can do everything repeated measures ANOVA can do, plus more. So, and this is kind of the critique that you see of repeated measures ANOVA in statistical literatures to say, you can even show that repeated measures ANOVA is just a special case of more modern methods like a latent growth model or a multi-level or mixed effect model. That though if you add constraints to those modern models, you will get repeated measures ANOVA if that is a question that you may have. But there's very little that repeated measures ANOVA can offer you that the more modern methods cannot.